could best help you with this, but on the page that says Lesson 1, which is page 1, I would encourage you to write September 10th on that page, all right? And here's why, because something's going to happen, you're going to be gone, you're going to be sick, you're going to be on vacation, and then you're going to go and you're going to say, what lesson are we on? And which is a fair question, and at least you'll be able to go back and say, Lesson 1 was on September 10th, and hopefully you can do the math and count forward to what week you are on. I debated on printing out a list in the front cover, but I didn't, just in case something happens and we're off a week. Of course, the week we have our spiritual emphasis days with a guest speaker, we won't be doing this particular series, but just wanted to make you aware of that. So September the 10th is today, and we're on lesson number 1. I'm very excited about this series. I'm really thrilled about the opportunity to go over this with you. This is something that I wish as a pastor that I would, as a Christian, that I would have grasped some of these concepts earlier. Probably, maybe they were taught to me and I missed them, I don't know. But it helps so much in our lives to grasp some of these truths. And so I hope it's a blessing. I got a little bit of a sort of a meme, a made-up meme in the bulletin today to just try to encourage some other people to think about being a part of this series, and I hope it's a blessing. Our series here in Growth Groups is set up in two main things. You know, we want you to learn something. That's one part of it. But the other part of it is to have you connect around the tables. And so that's why we have the tables set up so you can chat and visit about some different things. Our speaker talks about, or our writer here talks about visiting with a kid when they were young, a kid that had been to camp and asked who his favorite speaker was. And he told him and responded that his favorite speaker was so-and-so because they tell a lot of stories. And we enjoy stories. We as human beings like stories. And so I'm excited about this series. If you don't know what the word narrative means, you think of a narrator, somebody who tells you a story. And so we are studying and applying stories to our lives, and I'm really excited about it. So people love stories, and the question I want you to discuss at your table here in this first lesson is this: why do people love stories? What is it about stories that cause people to enjoy stories? Give me some different ingredients of stories or things about stories that cause people to like stories, all right? So discuss that at your tables. All right? All right, why do we enjoy stories? Let's get a couple different answers here. We'll start at this table. Give us one of your answers.
If you hear the stories from like veterans and stuff, you can learn about their lives under time of service and everything.
Okay, so some of it's learning. Okay, we learn. They tell us things about their history, their service. So we learn. What'd you guys say back here? Learning. That's the only thing you said? About what? History. Okay, yes. History. We enjoy stories that tell us about history. How about this table? What's something else you guys said?
Get to view somebody's past a little bit.
Okay.
A little snippet, as long as it's true, you know.
Okay. A view of their past, as long as it's true. Okay, good. Did your table say anything else?
I said it was engaging and entertaining.
Okay, they're engaging and entertaining. Okay, stories are that way. Anything else you guys said? I think stories can be easy to listen to, right? Because they're engaging, they're easy to listen to, they're easy to follow. I think sometimes they connect to our lives, don't they? There's a sense in which they connect to us. We can relate sometimes to them, some crazy thing they did or something that they said. And we can say, oh yeah, I've been there. Or I would never want to be there, or something like that. But they connect to our lives. And so there's something about a story that just reaches out and grabs us and pulls us in. And the statistic that he gives us in the second paragraph, how much of the Bible is stories? 45%. Almost half of the Bible is filled with stories. And again, these stories are not fictional. These are not made up. They are real stories, real life accounts. Narrative in that sense. But they're not mere stories, though they do contain excellent storytelling. They communicate powerfully. All right? There are powerful ways of God communicating. And he gives examples. Okay? We can say God is powerful, but when you read the story of Elijah up on Mount Carmel and the prophets of Baal and that battle going back and forth, and then God sends fire down from heaven and consumes the sacrifice, you see God's power at a whole nother level through that story, right? We can say God is love, but when you read the story of how he died on the cross, the narrative, the history of that, there's something powerful about that. So, what's your favorite Bible story? All right? Maybe you have more than one, but what's one that just fascinates you, engages you, pulls you in? All right? Try to everyone think of one. A favorite story that you have. All right? Take a minute around the table and share what your favorite Bible story is. All right, so favorite stories. A couple people, who wants to tell us your favorite story, at least the main title of it or whatever? Anybody?
Job and Ruth.
Who?
Job and Ruth.
Job and Ruth, okay. How about you guys back there? Samson? Evan, do you have one? Still thinking? Okay, that's fine. Here?
David and Goliath.
David and Goliath, okay. Anybody else? Favorite story at your table? Creation, okay. Anybody else at this table? So I only took one from you guys. Joseph, okay. I was thinking about the Old Testament, and there's this prophet, and God sends him to talk to the king, and I haven't reviewed, so I'm not going to give you a lot of details, but he's going to go to the king, and he's got to pronounce judgment on the king, and God says, go and pronounce the judgment, and then come back a different way, and don't stop, don't talk to anybody. And so he goes and he pronounces the judgment, and on his way back, this other prophet comes and says, oh, you should come and hang out with me for a little while. And he disobeys what God has told him to do, and he hangs out with this other prophet, and as a result, he gets back on his donkey the next day and is headed the rest of the way home, and a lion comes and kills the disobedient prophet and doesn't even touch the donkey, and it's an amazing story. Why does it happen? How does this lion kill the prophet, not kill the donkey? Why does this prophet die? It's an amazing story. And stories are just that way. I thought about, offering gift cards if anybody else wanted to stand up here and tell us their favorite story, for in like 1 minute or 2 minutes, and let you impromptu tell a Bible story. But Bible stories are awesome things. They communicate to us in powerful ways. Now, our text for today is Judges 15. So let's go to Judges 15. And this is really the only time that he's not focused in on the life of Abraham. And I think probably basically because in all of the other lessons, he pretty much used up all the stories of Abraham. But this is a nice short story here from the book of Judges, chapter 15. This is in connection with Samson's life. Judges 15, verse 1. But it came to pass within a while after, in the time of wheat harvest, that Samson visited his wife with a kid, and he said, I will go in to my wife into the chamber, but her father would not suffer him to go in. And her father said, I verily thought that thou hast utterly hated her. Therefore I gave her to thy companion. Is not her younger sister fairer than she? Take her, I pray thee, instead of her. And Samson said concerning them, Now shall I be more blameless than the Philistines, though I do them a displeasure. And Samson went and caught 300 foxes and took firebrands and turned tail to tail and put a firebrand in the midst between two tails. And when he had set the brands on fire, he let them go into the standing corn of the Philistines and burnt up both the shocks and also the standing corn with the vineyards and olives. And so here is our story, and we're going to walk through and get some principles as we kind of study this short 5-verse story here. And I want you to see some of these truths. Oh, come on now. There we go. First principle that we want to learn is this. Narratives or stories, true Bible stories, records of events, they teach by implication instead of proposition. Now, there's two big words in that statement there, okay? Proposition. Proposition is where the truth is clearly proposed. Okay, you're in chapter 15. Go to chapter 17. Chapter 17. And the book of Judges actually does have a proposition and tells you the reason he's telling you these stories, but it's kind of rare for this to happen. Verse 6, 17:6. In those days there was no king in Israel, but every man did that which was right in his own eyes. That's brought out a couple different times in the text. Chapter 18 and verse number 1. 18 and verse number 1. In those days there was no king in Israel. And then look at 21:25 at the very end of the book. 21:25. In those days there was no king in Israel. Every man did that which was right in his own eyes. All right, it's a stated proposition. It tells you this is the reason that I'm telling you this story. But many times when he gives you these real life stories, these true stories, he doesn't tell you the reason why. It's implied. All right? The word implication is the idea of a suggestion. The truth that he wants to give you is just suggested. He's not going to come right out and say, and this is the moral of the story. You're not going to always find that when you read through the stories. As a pastor, it would make my job so much easier if that were the case. All right? But it's not always there. It's implied. It's suggested. You have to draw the conclusion from what you read in the story, and it's not going to be specifically stated. It's implied. All right? So that's the first thing. You've got to know about stories. That what God wants you to learn is going to be implied, not specifically proposed to you. Number 2. All right? Narratives often build upon each other. And he asks here at question number 1, bottom of page 1, what would you find confusing in this story if you didn't know the background of Judges and Samson? Now, I wrote 4 different things down here. See if you can come up with at least one. Maybe you already did the lesson, and so you have some written down here. What would be confusing about this lesson if you didn't already know the story of Samson and Judges from the previous chapters? Who can give me something? Let's just do one big group, okay?
Why did the girl's father think that Samson hated her?
Okay, we don't know why Samson would have hated her. The dad would think that, okay? That's an important thing. What else? What else don't we know from this without previous stories?
We wouldn't know why a Jew was going to marry a Philistine.
Okay, why is a Jew marrying a Philistine? Good. What else? Why is he visiting his wife? I mean, why? Why wasn't he already with her? We wouldn't know that. We wouldn't know, and I guess that's kind of similar to what Bob was saying, his wife marrying another here, and kind of all that part. Stories build on each other, all right? And so when we study any part of the Bible, we've got to go back and see what happened before and pull it in. Many of the times when I'm preaching through Ephesians, in fact, today I'll give you just a little snippet of what we've learned about Ephesians because that sets us in the proper understanding for this. Have you ever been telling a story and somebody walks in halfway through? And they walk in and they hear this one line and they're like, well, I came into this conversation at the wrong time, you know? And something goofy is said, something weird is said. And to everybody else, they're just like, well, yeah, that was part of the story that made sense. But to them, because they didn't hear the beginning of the story, the whole thing just sounds really bizarre and really weird. Well, if you just jumped into Judges 15, 1 through 5, and you didn't go back and study what God had already said, there's a lot that's weird. And so stories often build on each other, and you've got to know the whole story. I mean, that's an expression, right? He didn't know the whole story. You got to know the whole thing. All right, third point. Not every narrative detail is significant to the narrative's meaning. But many times we give a lot of details just to help make it a story. We find that in the parables. All right, Jesus is giving this story. He's given this parable here. He's got all of these details. But listen, that doesn't necessarily mean that every little detail in that parable has some significance and meaning. I was noticing this. I so appreciated Brother Stedman being with us back in at the end of March. And as we were at the men's retreat, I can still picture him standing there by that big fireplace and preaching to us as men. And he told this story. I don't even remember all the details of the story, but I remember as a preacher listening to him tell the story. And he gave all this background information and gave all this detail about this story, this event. And then he kind of just went on with a little part of it and made his point over here. And the point that he had to make was actually just from one little part of the story, but you appreciated it so much more because he gave you all this other information that went with it. And yet all that information wasn't the point. It was just one little part of the story that was the point. And we want to be careful about that because sometimes if we pull on some of those wrong details, it can be an issue, okay? So some of these different details here. Question number 2, what are some details from Judges 15 that are true but may not be as crucial to the story as other details? What are some details in here? Yeah. Okay, prepared a kid. All right, first of all, that's not a child, right? It's a goat. And why a goat and not beef? I mean, come on. You know? But that really doesn't matter. That's not part of the story. Good point. What other details are brought out here?
He could have said, he just destroyed the fields, but like, he went and caught a bunch of foxes, and that's like how he just, burned the fields down.
Okay.
And it's interesting, but it's,
Yeah.
Yeah, there's 300 of them, but he could have said he burned all the fields or whatever.
But doesn't it pull us into the story that he gives us? Okay, he caught the 300 foxes and he tied their tails together. And every little boy in Sunday school that learned that story for the first time is like, wow, that's awesome. And if he would have just said he got mad and went out and destroyed their fields, like, But that detail isn't something that necessarily matters for us applying that story to our lives. We'll talk about that more in a little bit, a little bit of a minute. That too. All right.
You stole my thunder.
Okay. All right. Another one, that her sister was cute. I mean, I suppose that helps the dad's point here, but it's not some significant part of the story. He says that she is fairer than her sister. All right. So just understand that sometimes details are given because it's a story and you need to know those details. And it helps engage you in that, but it's not part of you getting the moral of the story, the implication. All right. So that's third. Number 4. Narratives illustrate doctrine but do not teach new doctrine. At its best, it's unwise to build a doctrine or practice from a narrative without other supporting passages. So like if you come to a story and you're like, this story teaches us this, and it's not found anywhere else in the Bible, you probably want to be a little careful with that. All right? They illustrate. What does the word illustrate mean? They bring it to life so I get it. I see it. That makes sense. All right, but they don't necessarily give us new doctrine. He likes to use the expression, they describe what happens as opposed to sometimes prescribe. You got to understand some of those different. Prescribe means this is what you're supposed to do versus describing something. Question 3, what would it look like if someone were to take this account of Samson as a guide for dealing with life's disappointments? Okay, a lot of death and destruction in our culture. What else? You'd have to burn something, yes. Animal cruelty, yes. Okay, it would imply that vengeance is okay. All right. The example that he gives as he writes the material is if you have a bad day at school, you go catch 300 squirrels and turn them loose on the school grounds. That is not what you're supposed to do. All right. That's not what the passage is saying. To turn 300 burning squirrels loose on your school grounds there. So obviously we have to be careful on that. We have to be careful of reading too much into the story, and we have to be careful of reading too little into the story in the sense that, we're looking for some little hidden meaning everywhere. That's reading too much. Too little means we miss the big picture. All right? We miss the big truth that God has for us. Question number 4, in what ways could someone spiritualize Judges 15 instead of understanding it at face value? All right, so spiritualizing sometimes is just kind of taking facts in the story and putting some spiritual meaning on them that isn't really part of the text. How could you spiritualize this story? Well, there's 300 foxes, and 300 is the length of the ark. And so really the 300 foxes are a picture of the ark and the flood. And or you could say 300 foxes, and Gideon, earlier in the book of Judges, had 300 soldiers. Or 300 foxes remind us of the fact that Samson had 300 concubines. And that was bad, and 300 foxes were bad, and something like that. All right, I'm making all that up, all right? And that's a lot of times what people do with spiritualizing. They are looking for that. Our author of this study, he makes up this one. He says, well, now Samson is a picture of Christ, and he's coming to get his bride, who is the church, and, the foxes are the tribulation and the hardship that's going to come on the world, and no, okay? That's not what the story does. And there have been some periods in church history in which that's kind of how people tried to interpret the Bible. And as hard as it is to interpret it the right way, I'm really glad that's not how we interpret it. that I would have to sit in my office there and figure out now 300. What can we do to make that 300 connect to people's life and apply to their lives and stuff like that, you know? That's not how we interpret it. So that's spiritualizing here. And so you got to be careful. You don't come up with some new doctrine from that. Understand that the truth that you see in the text should be something that comes up in other passages of Scripture as well. So these are the four key things that you need to know about narratives. He's got them in bold print there. Before we go any further, comments, questions about those four? So, number one, most of the time you're not going to find a clear statement. This is why I'm telling you the story. You're going to have to look for details in the story. And honestly, that's why we're having this series. So you'll learn how to read the details. Number two, they build on each other. You got to understand what was leading up to the story you're studying there. Number three, not every detail is significant. Okay, you're looking for the big moral of the story. And number four, you're not trying to teach some new doctrine through it. You are illustrating a truth from the Word of God that is taught elsewhere, all right? And so stories, okay? Second part of this, let's look at some key questions that you can answer, and he gives the first one there at the bottom of page number 2. As you're studying stories, you can ask these questions. Why? I think, did Brother Jerplin last week mention questions in his one of his sermons? I think he talked about using questions when he studies. I know we also talked about it just in our casual conversation over the weekend when he was here. But you can come into a story and ask these questions, and it'll get you a lot of mileage. Why did God give us this story? He gave us a story for a purpose, to teach us something about it. And often, that thing that is taught is connected to God himself. All right? He suggests, top of page number 3, that, and he's kind of giving you a little hint in advance here, that the moral of this story is that God faithfully delivers and provides for unfaithful servants. Samson is unfaithful. He's doing things he shouldn't, and yet God is faithful to him. All right? Second question that we consider is we ask the question, where? And this is the context. All right? Again, They build, the stories build on each other. And so what came before and what hints at what comes next? And we know from chapter 13 that Samson had a mission from God. And we know from chapter 14 that Samson disobeyed God by marrying a Philistine and breaking his Nazirite obligations. And yet God still allowed him to have some great victories in chapter number 15. For you to appreciate 15, you have to know the whole story from 13 and 14. You got to know the context. Sometimes you come into a story and you're like, I just want to study the story. I don't want to go back and figure out the background. I want to tell you that many times in my studies, that point of context makes all the difference. The whole passage comes to life when you go back and say, oh, I get it. This falls in this connection, this progression. Look at all that he was saying before that. If you'll go back and pick up the flow of the story, or even in the epistles, the flow of what the writer has been saying, half your work's done. It'll just open up to you, and you'll understand it in a much greater way. So ask that question. Number 3, you can ask the question of how, which is the structure. Now, sometimes when we're telling stories, we rabbit trail. And what story could be said in just a minute or two takes us 15 minutes to tell the story, right? God isn't rabbit trailing. He wants you to know the details that are there. He wants you to know the story. He writes with a purpose. And our author tells us in chapter number 15 that there are 4 different amazing things that Samson does in that chapter. What are some of them? Can you skim down through the chapter? And let's talk as one big group here. What are some of the things that Samson does here in this chapter? Okay, he catches the 300 foxes. Pretty amazing thing there. Okay, kills 1,000 Philistines with the jawbone of the donkey. What are some of the other miracles in the passage in chapter 15? Okay, verse 15, the jawbone there Julius is talking about, and then my wife was talking about just before that in verse 14, he's tied up, and I think it's his own people that tie him up. Isn't that crazy? Here you are trying to do what's right and deliver them, and they're like, no, we don't want any problems. We're going to tie you up ourselves and give you to the bad guys. And they tie him up, and he breaks those ropes, those cords. And then how does the book end? Or the chapter end? What's the miracle there?
God provides a fountain for his thirst.
Yeah, out of what?
Jawbone.
Out of the jawbone. God provides water out of the jawbone. So here are these amazing and incredible things that happen, and yet they happen in a context right after Samson kind of fails pretty big time here. So that context and that structure of understanding these four main things, that miraculous feats that are connected to Samson's life, help us to understand the point God's trying to make here. All right, the next question, the fourth question is what? What is happening in this narrative? Who is speaking in this narrative? What are they doing? What is the problem? How does it resolve? And so if you're reading the story and you're in chapter 14, you're like, but Samson is not doing what's right. Is God going to continue to use Samson? And you come into chapter number 15 and you find that God does use Samson despite his failures. Though he's unfaithful, God uses him. And hey, isn't that a pretty awesome truth for all of us? Isn't that a pretty great truth that God uses us in spite of our failures? Because every one of us have failed. And so that brings us to the awesome question, number 5, so what? Which is the application question. All of Scripture is profitable, and God gave us these narratives to instruct us and teach us. 1 Corinthians 10 and verse number 11, that whatsoever things happened before were given for our learning. In other words, the Old Testament was given so we'd learn from it. And I underlined these words in the third line there. They should influence my feelings, underline that word, thoughts, words, and actions. There may be some other things that you could say there, but feelings. Okay. He gave you the implication at the top of page number 3 that God faithfully delivers and provides for his unfaithful servants. Okay, that's the moral of the story. Or you can see it at the end of the what question. God used Samson despite his failure. What's the feeling? Somebody tell me, what's the feeling that you should get as a result of this story? Gratitude. Praise. What an awesome God. That though I sin on a daily basis, that though I mess up on a regular basis, wow, what a God. I mean, does it ever bother you when you sin? Does it ever discourage you? Yeah. But wow, it should encourage us. There ought to be praise. There ought to be gratitude. There ought to be appreciation. What an awesome God. All right, so that's the feeling. What could be a thought? What thought could you have? Now, thoughts and feelings sometimes are similar, but what thought could you have?
How can I be more faithful?
Yes. If this is the way God is to me, I want to be faithful to him. And how can I be more faithful to him? I mean, it's motivational. We could say inspiring, though that would be a little bit more on the feeling side of it. But it gives me this thought, man, if God is faithful to me when I sin in my life, I want to be faithful to him. All right, that's the thought. What's the word? What words could come out of your mouth because of this story? Okay, praising God. Absolutely. What other words? Okay, those were words to God. How about words to other people based on the story? What words could you say to somebody else based upon this story? How could you use this story to help someone?
Even if you have terrible things in your life, God can still use you if you
Right.
ask for his forgiveness.
Yes. So I can tell this story and I can encourage other people with the story. No, the story is not there to say, hey, live however you want to. That's not the point of the story. And ultimately, Samson's going to pay the price for some of that. But the story I can use to encourage other people. I learned this in my life. I can go and tell other people about it. All right, so my words in that way. How about actions then? I can serve him. I can serve him faithfully. I can get out there and do it and serve him faithfully with my life. So I think those 4 parts of the application, feelings, thoughts, words, and actions, are important. When we describe our soul, we often describe it as our mind, our emotions, and our will. Our will are our choices, what we decide we're going to do with our will. So it impacts our thoughts. That's one of the words he uses. Our emotions, that's our feelings, and our will, which would include our words, our actions, our choices. And I think if you, as we do these studies in the next few weeks, if you'll remember those 4 words, it'll help you to think of applications for your life. All right, so here's the procedure over the next 12 weeks. And can you notice the graphic on the screen? I just want you to see how the 5 questions shift slightly, all right? He's going to ask these 3 questions first to help you interpret the story. And then he's going to ask this 4th question to help you get the implication, the moral of the story, and then apply it. And so you can see that on page number 4. All right, so first thing that we're going to do every week is we're going to get the interpretation of the story of Abraham. All right, what does it mean? Now, I don't know how much you've been studying the Bible and applying it to life, but there have been times probably in my life in which I'm at point number 3, application, and I read a story, and right away I start writing applications, and then I go back and study the story, and I find out, oh, that wasn't what the story was talking about at all. And you're like, ah. And to use preacher words, you have this great idea, and that would have preached. That would preach great. It just isn't what the passage is saying. So if you skip ahead and you do step 3, application, before you know that's what the passage is actually teaching, you're going to have a problem. So you want to get the right interpretation. Get the context, other stories, get the structure, all right, the different pieces of it, get the content, what's going on in the story, so that you can understand this is the story, all right? And then number 2, the implication. All right? This is the truth. If you boil it all down to one truth, the truth for this story is God faithfully delivers and provides for his unfaithful servants. Or God used Samson despite of his failure. All right? That's the truth. That's the principle. You want to boil it down to one principle that helps us in our lives. And then number 3, how can I apply this to my life? How can I live out this truth? And use those 4 words there, thoughts, words, actions, attitudes, or emotions there. And take the steps in order, all right? So that's what you're going to do this week. So turn the page here, lesson number 2, and I want to encourage you, you all have your own books now, write your name on the front cover, and this week try to do lesson number 2. This one is 2.5 pages. Most of them after this are just going to be the standard 2 pages, which is what our growth sheets are each week, all right? So try to read through it in advance, and I think you'll enjoy it. Any questions, comments? And not only will you learn these principles for this series and doing your homework, as it were, but pretty soon, as you're reading Bible stories, which are 45% of the Bible, you should be able to start applying these just when you're doing your own devotional reading the rest of the week. All right, takes a little bit of work. You can't just read through the story and say, oh, that was great about Daniel and the lion's den. You might have to dig a little, but you'll get a lot of treasure out of it. We're studying stories, learning and applying narratives to our lives. Father, I thank you so much that you gave us your word in so many engaging ways. Sometimes it's songs, sometimes it's sermons, and sometimes it's stories. And Lord, we thank you for this, and that these are real, they're true, and that, Lord, you were teaching us something with them. And so I pray that in these next weeks, this fall, that you'd help all of us to learn how to learn from stories, and then to put those principles in practice in all of our lives and for the rest of our lives, that we might grow in our understanding of the word, but also that we might grow as disciples of Jesus Christ. And I praise you for it in Jesus' name. Amen.